You are standing in a medieval village, at the edge of a field that no longer looks like a field at all. The soil is dark and wet. It has been wet for months. Your shoes sink into the ground as if the earth itself has grown tired of holding its shape. The grain that should be standing tall is flattened and pale. Some of it has begun to rot where it lies. This is not a single bad harvest. This is the beginning of a long failure that no one yet understands. In the early 14th century, bread was not simply food. It was the foundation of daily life. For most medieval people, bread made up more than half of what you ate. It appeared at every meal. It was used as a plate. It was used to thicken stews. It was used to measure wealth. When bread failed, everything else followed. When the fields failed, the world narrowed very quickly. The years leading up to the Great Famine were not obviously dangerous. Populations across Europe had been growing slowly for generations. New land had been cleared. Forests had been cut back. Marshes had been drained. You would have seen villages in places that had once been considered unsuitable for farming. Hillsides were terraced. Soil that had never been meant to grow grain was now forced to do so. These changes worked for a time. Yields were modest but steady. People learned to survive close to the edge. That edge became a cliff when the rains began. In the spring of the year 1315, the weather changed. Rain fell heavily and did not stop. It soaked the ground and returned again and again. Seed rotted before it could sprout. Fields flooded, roads became rivers of mud. The tools you depended on could not fix this problem. You could plow, but the soil would not dry. You could plant, but the seed would dissolve. Livestock suffered too. Hay could not be dried properly. Animals grew weak. Disease followed close behind. You might expect medieval people to blame poor planning or bad luck, but their explanations went in different directions. Many believed the famine was a punishment. Others thought it was a sign of the end of time. Few had a sense of climate patterns or long-term weather cycles. All you knew was that the sky would not clear and the grain would not grow. The first year was difficult, but survivable. Families tightened their belts. You ate less. You stretched what you had. You mixed grain with peas or beans when possible. You gathered wild plants. You slaughtered animals earlier than planned. The poor felt it first. Day laborers who depended on steady work found none. Beggars multiplied. Churches were crowded with people asking for help that was already running out. By the second year, the situation had worsened. There was little seed left to plant. What had been stored was eaten. Prices rose sharply. Bread, that once cost a small coin, now cost several times more. Wages did not rise to match it. Laws were passed in some regions to control prices, but they did little. Merchants could not sell what they did not have. Grain could not be moved easily on flooded roads. Even regions with slightly better harvests could not supply those with none. You would have noticed changes in daily life that went beyond hunger. People became quieter. Markets shrank. Festivals were cancelled. Weddings were postponed. Birth rates dropped. Parents delayed having children because they could not feed them. This was not a dramatic collapse, but a slow thinning of life. Chroniclers of the time recorded disturbing details in plain language. They wrote of people eating animals that were normally avoided. Dogs and cats disappeared from towns. In some places, people dug up roots usually left untouched. There were rumors of worse acts. Most historians believe many of these stories were exaggerated, but they reflect the fear of the moment. Hunger makes people imagine the breaking of all boundaries. Disease followed hunger closely. Malnourished bodies resist illness poorly. Dysentery spread through villages where clean water was already scarce. Animals weakened by lack of fodder fell ill and passed sickness to people. Mortality rose steadily, not in one great wave but in many small losses. A child here, an old man there, a neighbor who did not wake up. What made the Great Famine especially dangerous was its length. Medieval society could survive a single bad year. It had little ability to survive several in a row. Storage methods were limited. Grain spoiled easily. There were no large centralized reserves for ordinary people. Lords and monasteries held stores, but even these ran down. Charity existed, but it could not meet the scale of need. You might think that trade would solve the problem. Ships could carry grain from better regions. In reality, trade networks were fragile. Ports were affected by storms. Inland transport was slow and expensive. Political boundaries interfered. Some rulers banned exports to protect their own populations. Others seized grain by force. These actions saved some and doomed others. The famine also revealed how close medieval Europe already was to its limits. Population growth had pushed agriculture onto marginal land. When climate conditions shifted slightly cooler and wetter, those lands failed first. There was no buffer. The system had been efficient but brittle. As you lie awake at night in this imagined village, you are not thinking in terms of systems or climate trends. You are thinking about tomorrow, about how much bread is left, about whether the rain will stop, about whether the seed you saved should be planted or eaten. Every choice carries risk. Eat now and starve later. Plant now and lose everything if the crop fails again. By the end of the second year, the famine had spread across much of northern Europe. Tens of thousands were dead. In some regions it was far more, yet there was no single moment when people realized how close they were to collapse. It happened quietly, through empty bowls and closed markets and graves, dug a little too often. And as the rains continued, and the stores emptied, you would have wondered whether the land itself had changed forever, and whether bread would ever return to its place at the center of life, or whether this slow disappearance was only the beginning of something even worse. You wake each morning to the same sound: rain on thatch, rain on wood, rain soaking into a world that has already absorbed too much. By the third year of the famine, the rain itself has become a kind of presence in your life. It shapes every decision. It decides whether you work or wait, whether you plant or give up, whether you eat today or save what little remains for tomorrow. By the year 1316, the Great Famine had moved from crisis to condition. It was no longer spoken of as a temporary hardship. It was simply how things were. Hunger had become part of the landscape, as familiar as the fields and the church bell. What had changed most was not the weather but the people themselves. Your body feels different now. Weaker, thinner, small injuries take longer to heal. Teeth loosen, gums bleed, children grow slowly or not at all. The elderly fade quietly. Medieval medicine has little to offer. Physicians speak of imbalances and corrupted humors. They prescribe rest and certain foods that no one can afford. Herbal remedies circulate, but their effects are limited. When the body lacks basic nourishment, communities begin to fray under the strain. In better times, villages relied on shared labor and mutual obligation. Now those bonds are tested. When everyone is hungry, generosity becomes dangerous. Giving bread to a neighbor may mean less for your own children. Suspicion grows. Accusations appear. Some are accused of hoarding, others of stealing. Small disputes turn bitter quickly. Authorities respond in uneven ways. Kings and local lords issue proclamations calling for order. Some organize grain distributions from remaining stores. Others focus on maintaining control rather than relief. Punishments for theft grow harsher, even as theft becomes more common. A loaf of bread can now be worth a life. Records from the period show executions for food theft that would have been unthinkable in earlier decades. You might assume monasteries provided a steady source of aid. In some places they did. Monastic communities had traditions of charity and storage. Yet they too were affected by poor harvests. Their lands flooded. Their rents declined. Some monasteries reduced admissions. Others limited almsgiving to protect their own survival. Even institutions built around stability found their foundations weakened. Travel becomes more common despite the danger. People leave their villages in search of food or work. Roads fill with the displaced. Families break apart as parents send children elsewhere in hopes they will survive. Many never see each other again. Urban centers swell with migrants who find little waiting for them. Cities had no capacity to absorb this influx. Disease spreads more easily in crowded conditions. Chroniclers begin to note changes in behavior that suggest deep psychological strain. They write of apathy, of people no longer reacting strongly to death. Funerals are rushed or omitted entirely. Graves are shallow. In some areas, bodies are buried in shared pits, not out of disrespect but necessity. There are simply too many and too few hands. The famine also reshapes the relationship between people and authority. Trust erodes. When rulers fail to prevent hunger, they lose legitimacy in the eyes of their subjects. Rebellions do not erupt immediately, but resentment takes root. You begin to question whether those above you truly serve a purpose if they cannot ensure survival. What makes this period particularly exhausting is the absence of clear information. News travels slowly. Rumors spread faster than facts. One week you hear that the harvest will be better in the south. The next you hear that it has failed everywhere. You hear stories of regions untouched by famine and imagine escape. Often these stories are exaggerated or false. Weather patterns continue to frustrate recovery. Even when rain lessens, it often arrives at the wrong times. Late frosts damage young crops. Short growing seasons reduce yields. Medieval agriculture depends heavily on predictability. Without it, planning becomes guesswork. You gamble with every planting. Livestock populations collapse further. Oxen die from disease and lack of fodder. Horses weaken. Without animals, plowing becomes harder. Fields shrink not because land is unavailable, but because there is no strength left to work it. This creates a vicious cycle. Fewer animals mean less grain. Less grain means fewer animals survive the winter. The social hierarchy shifts subtly during this time. Some wealthy landowners lose tenants and income. Others consolidate power by acquiring abandoned lands. Smallholders disappear. Wage labor becomes more common as people sell their work for food rather than money. These changes will shape medieval society long after the famine ends. Religion remains central, but its tone changes. Sermons focus on endurance rather than hope, on humility rather than reward. Some preachers warn against despair while others reinforce it by framing the famine as deserved punishment. Pilgrimages increase as people seek divine intervention. Ironically, these journeys sometimes spread disease further. Despite everything, life continues in small, stubborn ways. Children are still born, fields are still turned when possible. Songs are still sung, though more quietly. This persistence is not heroic in the modern sense. It is simply what happens when stopping entirely is not an option. By the end of the third year, the famine begins to ease in some regions. Rains lessen. Harvests improve slightly, yet recovery is uneven and fragile. Many who died cannot be replaced. Skills are lost. Fields lie abandoned. The memory of hunger lingers even when bread returns to the table. As you sit in this imagined village watching a modest crop finally grow, you may feel relief mixed with fear, relief that the worst might be over, fear that it could return at any time. You have learned how thin the line between survival and collapse truly is, and how easily the most basic food can vanish from daily life. And you may wonder whether this slow disaster has permanently changed how people will farm, trade, and trust one another, or whether the lessons of hunger will fade as quickly as the rain once the fields grow green again. When the rains finally begin to loosen their grip on the land, there is no celebration. You do not yet trust the sky. Clouds break and return. Sunlight appears briefly, and then vanishes again. The ground remains heavy with water and memory. You have learned not to hope too quickly. By the year 1317, the famine has entered a quieter phase. Death does not stop, but it slows. The fields yield something again, though not much. Bread returns in small dark loaves, mixed with whatever can stretch the flour, peas, bran, even ground bark in some regions. It is bread in name more than substance, but it is enough to keep bodies moving. What becomes clear now is how deeply the famine has reshaped medieval society. The losses are not evenly spread. Some villages are nearly empty, others survive intact. Entire families have vanished, leaving no record beyond a collapsed roof or an overgrown field. In legal documents, land is described as vacant, not because it was abandoned voluntarily, but because there is no one left to claim it. You notice how quiet the countryside has become. Fewer animals, fewer voices. Fields that once required many hands now lie half-worked. This emptiness creates opportunity and danger at the same time. Lords encourage new tenants to settle abandoned land, often offering better terms than before. Wages rise slowly because labor is scarce. This shift benefits survivors, but only after unimaginable loss. Food systems change in subtle ways. People become more cautious. Storage practices improve where possible. Communities rebuild granaries. Some towns regulate grain more carefully, learning from earlier failures. There is no central reform across Europe, but local memory guides small improvements. These changes are uneven and fragile, but they represent adaptation. The famine leaves a mark on how people think about authority. Rulers who fail to provide relief are remembered poorly. In some regions, revolts and unrest follow in later decades, fed by long resentment. The idea that a king should protect his people from starvation gains strength even if the means to do so remain limited. Religious life also shifts. Some lose faith. Others cling to it more tightly. The famine does not destroy belief, but it complicates it. People question why suffering fell so unevenly, why some survived and others did not. These questions linger quietly in sermons and prayers without clear answers. Perhaps the most lasting impact is psychological. Those who lived through the famine carry its habits for the rest of their lives. They save food even when it is plentiful. They distrust abundance. They teach their children to fear waste. This inherited caution shapes behavior for generations. Historians looking back see the Great Famine as a warning. It reveals how close medieval Europe was to ecological limits, how dependent life was on stable climate and fragile systems. It also sets the stage for later disasters. When the Black Death arrives a few decades later, it finds a population already altered by hunger and loss. Yet the famine also demonstrates resilience. Despite everything, society does not collapse entirely. People adapt slowly, imperfectly, and unevenly. The world continues not because it is strong, but because stopping is not possible. As you imagine standing once more in that village, watching a modest harvest come in, you understand that survival here is not triumph. It is continuation. Bread returns to the table, but it carries memory in every bite. Memory of absence. Memory of fear. Memory of how close the ordinary act of eating came to disappearing altogether. And you are left with a quiet question that echoes beyond the medieval world. How often do societies stand on the edge of disappearance without realizing it? And what unseen pressures today might be thinning the foundations of everyday life, just as silently as the rain once did? You live in a town where sound never fully stops. Even at night, there is movement. Wood creaks. Animals shift. Somewhere nearby, something scratches softly behind a wall. You tell yourself it is nothing important. Perhaps a mouse. Perhaps the wind. You do not yet understand that the small sounds you ignore are signs of a much larger imbalance quietly forming around you. In medieval towns, animals were everywhere. Not just horses and cows and chickens, but creatures that shared human space without invitation. Dogs wandered freely. Pigs rooted through refuse. Cats moved in and out of homes almost unnoticed. They slept near hearths and barns and alleyways. They were useful and tolerated, rather than cherished. Their purpose was simple. They hunted. Cats were not loved in the modern sense. They were practical tools. They controlled rodents that consumed grain and spread filth. In a world where food storage was limited and hygiene poorly understood, this role was critical. Yet cats also occupied an uneasy place in medieval imagination. They were quiet, independent, active at night. They did not submit easily. These traits made people suspicious. Over time, that suspicion hardened into fear. By the late Middle Ages, cats began to acquire darker meanings. Folklore linked them to misfortune. Black cats in particular were seen as omens. Some religious authorities associated them with heresy or witchcraft. Stories circulated of cats aiding evil forces or disguising demons. These ideas did not appear everywhere at once, but they spread gradually through sermons, rumors, and local traditions. You might hear a priest warn against creatures that lurk in darkness. You might hear neighbors whisper about strange behavior. A woman who lives alone keeps cats. A man claims to have seen glowing eyes near a crossroads. None of this seems urgent at first. It feels like background noise of belief, yet belief shapes behavior over time. In some towns, cats began to disappear. Sometimes they were driven away. Sometimes they were killed deliberately during festivals, meant to cleanse communities of perceived evil. These events were framed as acts of protection. People believed they were removing a threat. They did not see the larger danger that followed quietly behind. As cats declined, rats thrived. Rats had always existed alongside humans, but their populations were kept in check by predators and competition. Remove one element, and the balance shifted quickly. Rats reproduced rapidly. They adapted easily to human environments. They fed on stored grain and waste. They moved through walls and floors unnoticed. Where cats vanished, rats multiplied. You would have noticed changes slowly. Grain stores emptying faster than expected. Chewed sacks, droppings near hearths. At night, the scratching grew louder. Still, many dismissed it as nuisance rather than warning. Medieval people understood pests but not population dynamics. Few connected the loss of cats to the rise of rats in a systematic way. Urban life made the problem worse. Towns were dense, waste disposal was primitive. Streets often doubled as sewers. Food scraps accumulated. Rats found everything they needed. They nested in roofs, cellars, and foundations. They moved freely between homes, markets, and docks. This explosion of rats created problems beyond lost food. Rats carried parasites. Fleas lived on their bodies, feeding on blood and moving easily between animals and humans. People noticed bites and itching but did not understand the cause. Illness followed patterns that seemed random. A household fell sick. a street emptied, a town mourned. At this stage, you are not yet facing the Black Death, but the conditions that would allow it to devastate Europe are already forming. The absence of cats is only one factor, but it is a significant one. It illustrates how cultural belief can override practical experience and how small choices can reshape entire environments. You might assume that medieval people were simply ignorant. In reality, many recognized the usefulness of cats. Some communities resisted anti-cat sentiment. In rural areas, cats often remained common because their value was obvious. The pattern was uneven. Where superstition was strongest, cat populations fell most sharply. This unevenness created pockets of vulnerability. Some towns became ideal breeding grounds for rats, while nearby villages remained relatively stable. Trade routes connected these places, allowing rodents and parasites to travel easily. Ships carried rats across rivers and seas. Markets brought people together. The network of medieval life amplified local imbalances into regional crises. What makes this story especially unsettling is its ordinariness. No single decision caused disaster. There was no proclamation ordering the removal of all cats. There were many small actions driven by fear, habit, and belief. Each one seemed harmless. Together they reshaped the urban ecosystem. You live your daily life unaware of these connections. You worry about bread prices, and rent, and weather. You may even feel safer knowing that supposed evil creatures have been removed. Meanwhile, the true danger multiplies beneath your feet. By the time illness becomes widespread, it is too late to reverse these changes quickly. Even if cats return, their numbers cannot rebound fast enough. Rats have established dominance. Fleas move freely. Disease spreads along the same roads that carry grain cloth and news. Standing in your narrow street watching shadows move along the walls, you might sense that something fundamental has shifted, that the familiar balance of town life no longer holds, that the quiet allies you once took for granted are gone, and something else has taken their place. And you may wonder how often fear of the wrong threat has opened the door to a far greater one, and whether people will ever recognize the moment when protection turns into vulnerability. You begin to notice that illness no longer feels isolated. It does not remain within a single household or strike without pattern. Instead, it moves slowly outward, touching neighbors, then entire streets. At first, the symptoms are mild: fever, fatigue, swelling. People blame bad food or damp air, they always have. But something about this sickness feels different. It arrives quietly and leaves quickly behind death. By the time fear truly settles in, the rats are everywhere. They move openly now. You see them in daylight, along market stalls and drainage ditches. Children throw stones at them without effect. Merchants curse them as they chew through sacks of grain already grown scarce. The absence of cats has allowed rats to lose their fear. They behave as though the town belongs to them. Medieval towns are ideal environments for infestation. Buildings are packed tightly together. Wooden beams create pathways above and below ground. Cellars are damp and cluttered. Food is stored in sacks, barrels, and chests that rats can easily penetrate. Waste accumulates in corners and alleys. Every element supports the expansion of rodents. People attempt solutions that seem logical to them. Traps are set. Poison is used where available. Dogs are encouraged to hunt. None of these methods are effective on a large scale. Rats breed faster than they can be killed. The problem feels endless and exhausting. At the same time, belief continues to shape behavior. Some see the rise of rats as further proof of moral corruption. Others blame foreigners, travelers, or specific social groups. Scapegoating becomes common. It is easier to accuse neighbors than to confront structural problems that feel unsolvable. You might notice changes in religious practice. Processions become more frequent. Prayers for protection fill churches. Candles burn day and night. People seek spiritual explanations because physical ones are unavailable. The language of sermons shifts toward purification and repentance. Illness is framed as consequence rather than accident. As sickness spreads, daily routines break down. Markets close intermittently. Trade slows. Farmers hesitate to bring goods into town. Craftsmen fall ill, and workshops shut their doors. Labor shortages appear not because work is unavailable, but because bodies are weakened or gone. The role of animals in urban life changes again, as rats become symbols of disease. Some towns reconsider their stance on cats, yet fear remains. Cats are still associated with darkness and witchcraft in many places. Even when tolerated, they are not protected. Their populations recover slowly, if at all. What medieval people cannot see is the link between rats, fleas, and disease. They observe patterns without understanding mechanisms. They know that sickness follows certain routes, but they misinterpret the cause. They blame air, water, or stars. They attempt to purify space through smoke or sound. Bells ring constantly. Fires are lit in streets. Strong smells are used to drive away invisible threats. Meanwhile, fleas move silently from rat to human and back again. They thrive in crowded, unsanitary conditions. They feed and multiply. When rats die in large numbers, fleas seek new hosts. Humans become those hosts. The transition is invisible and unstoppable. This moment represents a tragic convergence. Cultural fear removed a key predator. Environmental conditions favored infestation. Trade networks spread parasites. Medical knowledge lagged behind reality. No single factor caused catastrophe, but together they created a perfect opening. You may begin to question old beliefs. You notice that where cats remain, illness seems less severe. These observations are anecdotal and easily dismissed, but they plant doubt. Some individuals quietly protect cats or encourage their return. These actions are small and often private. As fear intensifies, social trust erodes further. Houses are sealed. Doors are barred. The sick are isolated or expelled. Families fracture under pressure. People fear each other as much as the disease. This fear shapes future behavior long after the crisis passes. Looking back, historians debate how significant the removal of cats truly was in the spread of plague. It is not the sole cause. Climate, trade, and bacteria play larger roles. Yet the disappearance of cats symbolizes a deeper problem: the replacement of practical knowledge with fear-driven belief, the loss of balance between humans and their environment. You stand now in a town transformed. Once familiar streets feel hostile. The sounds at night are louder than ever. Rats move freely. The quiet presence of cats is gone. Something essential has been removed, and its absence is felt in every corner. And you are left with an uneasy realization that survival does not always depend on grand decisions or visible enemies, but on small, overlooked relationships, and that misunderstanding them can tip entire societies toward disaster. By the time the danger becomes impossible to ignore, the streets already belong to the rats. You see them in daylight now, no longer cautious. They move along walls and through refuse piles with confidence. Children are warned not to chase them. Adults avoid stepping on them, not out of mercy, but fear. Something has gone wrong, and everyone feels it, even if no one can fully explain it. Illness spreads unevenly, which makes it harder to understand. One household is struck while another is spared. A single street mourns while the next continues as usual. Medieval people look for meaning in these patterns. They blame bad air, divine anger, foreign travelers, or moral failure. The true chain of cause remains hidden. Rats to fleas, fleas to humans. Cats absent from the equation entirely. As death increases, practical thinking slowly returns. In some towns, cats are quietly welcomed back, not through official declarations but through individual choices. A family allows a stray to remain near the hearth. A stable keeper feeds one deliberately. These acts are small and cautious. Old fears do not disappear easily. A cat is useful, but it is still watched carefully. There is no sudden recovery. Even where cats return, the balance takes time to shift. Rats reproduce faster than cats can hunt them down. Fleas continue to circulate. The damage is already done. What follows becomes one of the most devastating periods in human history, though few living through it see the full shape of what is happening. Looking back centuries later, historians argue about how much the loss of cats truly mattered. Some say it was only a minor factor among many. Others point out that medieval ecosystems were finely balanced and easily disrupted. Removing a key predator had consequences whether people understood them or not. What matters most is not the exact weight of the cause, but the pattern it reveals. This was not a story of stupidity. It was a story of belief overpowering experience. People knew cats caught rats. They saw it every day, yet fear and symbolism slowly rewrote that knowledge. Once a creature became associated with danger, its practical value was dismissed. Reality did not change to match belief. The environment responded according to its own rules. After the worst years pass, attitudes soften. Cats regain their place gradually. By later centuries, they are once again common companions in homes and barns. The superstition never fully disappears, but it weakens. Experience reasserts itself. People remember what happens when certain small helpers vanish. the lesson lingers quietly beneath the historical record. Medieval people did not almost vanish because of one dramatic mistake. They came close because of many small ones layered together. Misunderstood animals, ignored connections, everyday decisions made without seeing the larger system they supported. As you imagine the medieval town settling into a fragile calm, you can still hear the echo of scratching behind the walls, a reminder that survival often depends on ordinary things doing their unnoticed work, on balances maintained quietly, on companions valued not for symbolism but for what they actually do. And you are left with a final reflection that reaches beyond the Middle Ages. How many essential supports in any society remain invisible until they are gone? And how often does fear persuade people to remove exactly what is keeping collapse at bay? You begin to notice that sickness no longer feels isolated. It does not belong to one household or one unlucky family. It moves. It drifts from door to door, street to street, as if carried by the town itself. At first, this movement is subtle. A fever here, a swelling there. Someone collapses at market and is gone within days. These events are troubling but not yet extraordinary in a medieval world familiar with illness. What changes is the speed. In towns where rats now dominate the unseen spaces, disease accelerates. Fleas jump from rat to rat, then from rat to human. They hide in clothing and bedding. They bite while you sleep. You wake with itching and small wounds you barely notice. Days later, your body burns with heat. Lymph nodes swell painfully. Breathing becomes difficult. You do not know the cause. No one does. Medieval explanations focus on bad air, corrupted environments, or divine judgment. The idea that tiny creatures living on other creatures could transmit disease is beyond contemporary understanding. Even if someone suspects animals, rats are so common they feel unavoidable. Cats, once quietly helpful, are still absent or distrusted. Municipal responses are clumsy. Town councils order streets cleaned, fires are lit to purify the air, bells ring for prayers, processions fill the streets, ironically increasing contact. Some towns close gates, trapping disease inside. Others open them, spreading it outward. Every action feels reasonable in isolation. Few help. You would expect people to rethink the treatment of cats at this point. In some places they do. Cats begin to reappear quietly. People tolerate them again without public announcement. In other areas, fear remains stronger than experience. Cats are still associated with misfortune. The connection between their absence and rising illness remains unspoken or unnoticed. Rats continue to thrive because the conditions that support them are unchanged. Food waste accumulates. Grain storage remains insecure. Buildings are poorly sealed. Urban density grows as people seek safety behind walls. Each improvement for human defense becomes another advantage for rodents. The psychological effect of constant unseen threat is exhausting. You cannot see what endangers you, you can only feel its consequences. This uncertainty feeds panic and rumor. Some accuse outsiders, some accuse minorities, some accuse the poor. Violence flares sporadically, not because people are cruel, but because fear demands an outlet. As the plague years approach, these patterns intensify. The absence of cats is not the sole cause of catastrophe, but it magnifies vulnerability. Where rat populations are high, mortality rates soar. Where cats remain common, outcomes appear slightly less severe. These differences are subtle and inconsistent, but they matter. Modern historians caution against oversimplification. Cats alone could not have stopped the plague. Climate, trade networks, sanitation, and immunity all played roles, yet removing a natural control of rodents was undeniably harmful. It shows how cultural beliefs can undermine practical survival strategies without anyone intending disaster. You walk your street now more alert than before. You hear movement behind walls and under floors. You cannot stop it. You cannot control it. You can only endure. The quiet companions that once hunted these creatures are gone. Their absence feels larger now, heavier than before. As sickness peaks and then slowly recedes, you are left with a changed town. Fewer people, more silence, and a lingering question about what else might have been lost, because fear was allowed to decide policy over experience. And you may find yourself wondering whether people will remember the lesson hidden beneath the tragedy, or whether the pattern of misjudging small useful things will repeat again in some other forgotten form. By the time the full consequences of cat removal became apparent, the streets of medieval towns had changed in ways few could ignore. Rats now ruled the alleyways, attics, and granaries. Where once there had been small, manageable numbers of vermin, There were now swarms, thick, moving shadows under the moonlight. Their gnawing and scratching became the soundtrack of the night, replacing the subtle presence of cats that had kept their numbers in check for generations. You notice the losses first in practical terms. Stored grain disappears faster than expected, even from locked barns. Sacks of flour are shredded, seeds meant for planting vanish, and food meant to last the winter is consumed within days. The scarcity compounds the existing struggles of daily life. Families who were already cautious with their supplies find themselves forced to ration even more strictly. Small households, once self-sufficient, teeter on the brink of real deprivation. Beyond food, the presence of rats begins to affect public health in ways previously unimaginable. Fleas, using rats as hosts, multiply with alarming speed. They bite people and animals indiscriminately. Fevers, sores, and infections rise. Medieval medicine has little to offer, and the connection between rats, fleas, and disease remains invisible. Many villagers simply assume illness is punishment, divine wrath, or bad luck. In reality, they are living through the earliest stages of a public health crisis fueled by the imbalance they helped create. Trade routes exacerbate the problem. Merchants traveling between towns carry rats and fleas with them. Warehouses, markets, and ships become vector points for infestation. Cities that once prided themselves on order and cleanliness struggle to maintain control. Town councils pass ordinances attempting to trap or poison rats, but the scale of the problem overwhelms these efforts. Measures that might have worked with small populations of rodents now fail against numbers that multiply geometrically. You might notice subtle social consequences as well. Fear and superstition shift focus. Once it was cats who were distrusted, accused of witchcraft, of aiding evil. Now it is rats that embody danger. In some towns they are demonized in sermons, depicted as agents of punishment and symbols of corruption. People adapt old fears to new threats, yet their actions are still reactive rather than preventive. Efforts are piecemeal. No one yet realizes that the balance of nature has been permanently disrupted in their own homes. For those living through it, life becomes a matter of constant vigilance. Food is stored high and away from potential gnawers. Nighttime noise from scratching drives many to sleeplessness. Livestock and pets must be guarded carefully. You begin to see the ways in which ordinary life has shifted, how patterns of behavior have changed in response to a silent invasion. The work of survival is no longer seasonal. It is relentless, every hour, every day. As conditions worsen, the link between rats and disease becomes harder to ignore. Epidemics of plague-like symptoms sweep through towns and villages, sometimes killing a large fraction of the population. Historians today note that this period sets the stage for the later devastation of the Black Death. While cats alone did not prevent that catastrophe, their absence illustrates how small ecological shifts can amplify human vulnerability. Cultural beliefs, fear, and superstition indirectly facilitated this risk. In this changed world, the memory of cats lingers as a silent question. People remember the days when the quiet hunters moved among rooftops and barns, invisible yet effective. They recall the small comforts of control over their environment. The disappearance of cats shows how societies can undermine their own stability, not through malice or neglect, but through cumulative decisions that seem sensible at the time. Standing in your imagined medieval street, watching rats slip silently through the darkness, you confront a profound truth. The ordinary balance of life can unravel quietly, and the creatures you overlook or distrust can determine survival. Human choices intersect with nature in ways that are often invisible until it is almost too late. And you are left to ponder a larger, unsettling question. How many other times in history, and perhaps in the present, have small, seemingly insignificant decisions reshaped the very foundations of survival? How often does fear blind people to the allies they need most, leaving them vulnerable to consequences they could not have predicted? Imagine standing on the edge of a coastal village in northern Europe during the early 15th century. The wind is sharp, carrying the scent of salt and the cold bite of winter that lingers longer than it should. Waves crash against a seawall that has seen better days. In the distance, wooden houses lean precariously, their foundations threatened by the shifting sands and rising tides. This is a world quietly imperiled, shaped not by war or plague, but by a slow, creeping climate change that medieval people barely understood, the onset of what historians now call the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age was not a sudden freeze, nor a dramatic global event like an asteroid strike. It was a gradual, persistent cooling that lasted centuries. Average temperatures fell slightly, often by less than a degree or two, but the effects were cumulative and profound. Shorter growing seasons, harsher winters, wetter summers, and stronger storms created conditions that ordinary people could feel in every aspect of daily life. Fields that had been reliable for generations began to fail unpredictably. Rivers froze later and thawed later. Snow fell in months it had never been expected. In these villages, survival depended on subtle rhythms. Farmers planted according to the sun, the soil, and the local weather memory passed down through generations. Livestock bred on carefully timed cycles. Food stores were calculated precisely to last until the next harvest. Even a slight shift in seasonal timing could mean disaster. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, these rhythms were increasingly unreliable. Storms became both more frequent and more violent. The North Sea and the Atlantic coasts saw tidal surges that had no precedent in living memory. Wooden sea walls, dikes, and embankments, already aged and patched repeatedly, failed under the pressure. Villagers watched helplessly as protective structures collapsed, homes flooded, and farmland eroded. Entire villages were gradually swallowed by the sea. Unlike a single catastrophic storm, this was erosion and inundation that happened year after year, leaving only fragments of houses, overgrown fields, and scattered graveyards to mark the places people had once lived. You would have felt these changes in the most mundane ways first. Salt water intrudes on wells. Freshwater ponds stagnate or taste brackish. Crops planted in spring fail repeatedly. Fishing, a staple for coastal communities, becomes less predictable. Herring and cod shift farther offshore, or fail to appear in expected numbers. Food becomes harder to acquire. Every small failure compounds the next. Even the human response to these changes was fragile. Communities attempted repairs, sometimes collectively, sometimes piecemeal. Wooden stakes were driven into mud, new dikes were raised, sandbags stacked where possible. Sometimes these efforts succeeded temporarily, sometimes they failed completely. Resources were scarce. Labor was limited. Decisions were desperate and incremental. The economic consequences were slow but inescapable. Villagers who relied on surplus grain to trade found themselves unable to meet obligations. Taxes were demanded by lords who understood little of the changing climate. Rent and tithes fell due even as land yielded less than before. Those who could not pay were evicted, forced to move inland or to join precarious urban populations. Land that had been continuously occupied for centuries became abandoned and untended. As a resident, your daily life would have been dominated by small acts of adaptation. You would choose crops that tolerate wetter soil. You would move livestock to higher ground. You would ration fuel for cooking and warmth more strictly. You would plan journeys and trade with careful attention to the unpredictability of weather. Yet, no matter how careful, the relentless cold and rising waters eroded your options. You were trapped between the climate and the limits of human intervention. What makes this slow disaster especially insidious is that it did not always appear catastrophic. The cold was incremental. Storms destroyed a few homes at a time. Crops failed partially rather than completely. Yet the cumulative effect was staggering. Generation after generation saw their land shrink, their food security weaken, their communities fracture. The Little Ice Age did not strike suddenly. It whispered warnings in every shivering hand and every flooded field. Historians today note that entire villages vanished beneath sand and sea. Some disappeared from maps entirely. Archaeological surveys uncover wooden beams buried in peat, fragments of stone foundations and churchyards partially submerged. The people who lived there moved inland, joining other settlements or fleeing into towns ill-prepared for their arrival. They carried with them knowledge of coastal erosion, of unpredictable weather, and of fragile survival strategies. Yet even this knowledge could not prevent repeated disaster, as the climate continued to shift unpredictably. And as you imagine yourself in this village, watching the waves inch closer to your door, you may ask yourself a chilling question. If the land that sustained life for generations could vanish so quietly, without fire, war, or pestilence, how many other places in history, perhaps even today, are slipping into danger so slowly that people fail to notice until it is too late? The following year, the rhythm of life in the village shifts in ways both subtle and devastating. Winter lingers longer than ever remembered. Snow falls in late March, and frost persists well into May. Crops that normally take advantage of the early warmth fail to sprout. Fields lie wet and unworkable, the soil so saturated that plows sink uselessly into the mud. You consider planting hardy grains like rye, but even these struggle in the increasingly damp and cold earth. Food scarcity begins to dominate daily life. Where once villagers could rely on a steady mix of grain, fish, and livestock, now the table is uncertain. You notice that bread, always a symbol of sustenance, is thinner, coarser, and less frequent. Potatoes have not yet arrived in northern Europe, so the reliance on cereal grains is absolute. Every choice of planting, every sacrifice of seed for immediate consumption becomes a gamble. To plant is to risk starving later. To eat is to risk having nothing for the next season. Coastal storms continue relentlessly. You walk along the dikes and see them break in slow, inexorable pieces. Sand and silt are carried inland, depositing over arable land and roads. Houses nearest the water lean at precarious angles. Foundations rot in waterlogged soil. Families leave in stages, carrying only what they can, abandoning the remainder to the sea. Some villagers cling stubbornly, hoping for a reprieve, but the ocean does not relent. Economic pressures compound the crisis. Lords demand taxes on lands that no longer yield as expected. Merchants struggle to transport goods over muddy, flooded roads. The market, once a predictable place of trade and social exchange, shrinks as villages around it falter. You might witness neighbors leaving permanently, unable to pay rent or feed their families. The town's population fluctuates, sometimes sharply, as waves of migration bring the displaced in and push others further inland. You notice that social hierarchies begin to subtly shift. Skilled farmers who survive gain leverage. Their knowledge of coping with damp soils, rotating crops, or fortifying embankments becomes invaluable. Laborers, once plentiful, are scarce, driving up wages slightly, but only for those who survive. The old order, built on predictability and control, is increasingly fragile. Decisions made decades prior, how fields were cultivated, how embankments were maintained, suddenly feel inadequate. Disease begins to spread quietly, carried by the same conditions that threaten survival. Flooded wells and stagnant water create breeding grounds for pathogens. Malnutrition weakens bodies further. Even mild ailments can become fatal. Children, always the most vulnerable, bear the brunt. You notice graves appearing more frequently, often outside the churchyard, as soil and terrain change with floods and erosion. Funerals are hurried, practical rather than ceremonial. Amid the struggle, culture and belief adapt in small, telling ways. People pray for reprieve from storms, for dikes that will hold, for fields that will yield. Tales of drowned villages circulate, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes factual. You may hear stories of entire communities swept away, leaving only the church steeple or a lone tree as a marker. These narratives serve as cautionary reminders for those who remain. Survival is contingent, fragile, and dependent on both human effort and nature's mercy. Yet, not all responses are despair. Innovation emerges incrementally. Villagers experiment with higher embankments, drainage channels, and planting crops further inland. Timber houses are reinforced, and some are relocated to more stable ground. Fishing patterns shift with tides and fish migration. These adaptations are imperfect, uneven, and localized, but they represent resilience in the face of slow-moving catastrophe. Still, uncertainty dominates life. You awaken each morning wondering what the sea will bring. Will another storm wash away the newly fortified embankment? Will the fields finally produce enough grain? Will families that fled return? Or will they be replaced by strangers equally desperate? Every action carries risk. Every inaction may be fatal. Decisions once routine are now exercises in calculation, influenced by fear as much as necessity. And as you look over the horizon at waves lapping at the edges of abandoned fields and toppled homes, you are left with a troubling thought. How much of survival is determined by human effort, and how much is governed by forces beyond comprehension? Forces that, in their quiet persistence, can erase generations and reshape landscapes without a single dramatic event. By the fourth and fifth years of relentless cold and storm, the villagers along the coast are no longer the same. Homes lean precariously, or have vanished entirely, leaving piles of timber and scattered belongings in their wake. Fields that once yielded grain lie waterlogged, overgrown with salt-tolerant plants, or buried under sand deposits carried inland by relentless tides. You realize that the village you knew has slowly ceased to exist, not in a single dramatic moment, but through persistent erosion, failed crops, and unrelenting weather. Those who remain face choices defined by necessity. Families abandon long-held properties, dragging what they can carry inland, joining other settlements, or moving toward towns that seem more stable. The sense of community is fractured. Familiar neighbors disappear. Skills tied to the coastal environment, salt farming, certain fishing techniques, knowledge of tidal patterns are lost as people disperse. The human imprint on the landscape, once so deliberate and enduring, is erased slowly by climate and neglect. Economically, the region suffers as trade falters. Roads become impassable from flooding. Markets lose participants. Grain, once a steady medium of exchange, becomes scarce and expensive. Lords and tax collectors are forced to adjust expectations, sometimes allowing deferred payments or seizing fewer rents. Yet even these measures cannot restore stability. The natural environment continues to dictate the possibilities of human survival. Health and mortality remain precarious. Stagnant water, inadequate sanitation, and poor nutrition combine with cold winters to weaken populations. Disease spreads more easily among displaced and stressed communities. Malnourishment increases susceptibility to infection. You see children thinner than their years, adults stooped with exhaustion, and elders unable to survive the harsh conditions. Life expectancy falls quietly, without immediate recognition, as death seeps into ordinary existence, rather than striking in dramatic waves. Yet amid the destruction, human resilience persists. Some communities relocate entirely to higher ground, re-establishing homes, fields, and social networks. Ingenuity emerges in small, incremental ways. People reinforce remaining embankments with stone, dig new drainage channels, and experiment with crop varieties better suited to shorter seasons. Fishermen adapt to changes in fish migration, venturing further offshore or using alternative techniques. These adaptations do not restore what was lost, but enable survival, allowing culture and memory to continue in altered forms. Culturally, the experience leaves a lasting mark. Tales of drowned villages, shifting coastlines, and the precariousness of life circulate as warnings and lessons. Religious interpretation blends with pragmatic understanding. Some see divine punishment in the storms, others frame survival and adaptation as moral virtues. The memory of land lost to the sea shapes how people view the relationship between human effort and natural forces. Knowledge of tides, embankments, and weather becomes a vital part of communal wisdom, passed down through generations. For the individuals living through it, daily life is a constant negotiation with the elements. Each decision carries weight: where to plant, how to fortify a home, when to migrate, and how to ration food and firewood. The stakes are immediate and relentless. Small choices accumulate, determining who survives and who is swept away, literally and figuratively, by the forces reshaping the landscape. By the end of this period, some villages exist only in memory, submerged beneath mud, sand, or water. Others endure, transformed by experience. Their populations smaller, but their knowledge of survival deepened. The Little Ice Age reshaped the human and natural landscapes quietly but permanently. It demonstrated that slow, persistent environmental change could have effects as profound as sudden catastrophes, if not more insidious. Standing on the new high ground, looking back at the remnants of villages swallowed by the sea, you understand the precariousness of human life in the face of persistent environmental forces. You see both vulnerability and resilience, destruction and adaptation intertwined. The memory of loss lingers in every rebuilt embankment, every cautious planting, and every story passed from parent to child. And you are left with a reflective, lingering thought. If entire communities can disappear quietly under slow, persistent forces, how many other human endeavors, cities, cultures, or ways of life might already be eroding silently around us, unnoticed until it is too late? Picture yourself in a medieval dining hall, long and dimly lit by flickering candles. The walls are hung with tapestries to ward off drafts, the stone floor cold underfoot. You sit at a wooden table polished by decades of use, surrounded by nobles in heavy clothing, the air thick with smoke from the hearth and the scent of roasted meat. Food is abundant here, meat, bread, wine, but there is an invisible danger that you cannot see, taste, or smell. It hides in the very vessels from which you drink. Lead was a common material in medieval Europe. Cups, plates, spoons, and wine vessels were often fashioned from it. Prized for its malleability and weight, lead glimmered in candlelight, giving objects a polished appearance that suggested wealth and refinement. In noble households, it was not unusual to have ornate lead cups engraved with coats of arms, or tankards lined with thin sheets of lead. The more elaborate the design, the higher the status. You may assume that the danger of lead poisoning is modern knowledge, but in reality, people in the Middle Ages had little understanding of chronic toxicity. Illnesses that arose gradually, weakness, headaches, abdominal pain, cognitive dullness, were often attributed to humors gone awry, spiritual affliction, or general weakness. They were rarely linked to the very cups from which people drank wine, mead, or ale daily. Wine was a particular problem. To preserve it and improve taste, wine merchants and household stewards sometimes boiled it in lead-lined vessels. Lead acetate, sweet in flavor, could subtly enhance the taste of poor-quality wines. Over time, repeated consumption led to accumulation of lead in the body. You might not notice immediate effects. The symptoms appear gradually, often over months or years. It is not a dramatic poisoning with convulsions or immediate death, but a slow, insidious weakening of the body and mind. The consequences for noble households were significant. Chronic lead exposure could lead to infertility, miscarriages, gout, and neurological decline. A lord might find himself increasingly forgetful, irritable, or physically weak, yet attributing these changes to aging or imbalance was common. He might even suspect malicious poisoning from a rival, when in truth the hazard lay in everyday objects. The very vessels meant to display wealth and sophistication were silently harming those who used them. You would notice subtle patterns if you were paying attention. Certain households seemed unusually prone to reproductive difficulties. Children might fail to thrive. Advisors and guests could experience headaches or digestive upset after feasts. Chronic ailments were common, but their true source remained mysterious. Physicians prescribed herbal remedies or bloodletting, treatments that did little to prevent the continued ingestion of lead. Interestingly, lead poisoning intersected with other aspects of medieval life in curious ways. Recipes for syrupy wines, jellies, or confections sometimes included lead compounds as sweeteners. Some medicines themselves contained lead-based ingredients, believing in their curative power. The combination of food, drink, and medicine created cumulative exposure, a slow accumulation that few recognized. The wealthy, who could afford more vessels and more elaborate consumption, were paradoxically more at risk. You might assume that only accidental exposure mattered, but cultural and social habits amplified the danger. Feasts were frequent, celebrations frequent, and the display of wealth through food and drink was central to noble life. Drinking from ornate cups was a signal of status and refinement, yet with each sip came invisible harm. Even careful stewards, trying to maintain taste and quality, could not mitigate the risk because the underlying properties of lead were not understood. Yet, not every household suffered equally. Some regions relied on wooden, ceramic, or pewter vessels. Some nobles preferred imported cups or simple chalices. The disparity meant that lead poisoning was uneven, producing strange patterns of health decline across regions and families. Chroniclers sometimes noted weakness of the mind or melancholy in powerful figures without realizing that the cause was subtly woven into the daily rituals of drinking and dining. By the end of this period, you begin to understand that lead, in its quiet ubiquity, shaped human experience in ways far removed from immediate awareness. It was a silent sculptor of health, fertility, and even political stability. Decisions about material culture, taste, and prestige carried consequences invisible to contemporaries, yet profound in their impact. And as you imagine raising a lead cup to your lips in that medieval hall, you are left with a disturbing question. How often have the comforts and symbols of wealth in human history hidden dangers so subtle and pervasive that they escape notice for generations, quietly reshaping lives and societies without anyone suspecting? As time passes, the cumulative effects of lead exposure become more evident, though still largely misunderstood. In noble households, the symptoms emerge gradually. You might notice that lords and ladies grow irritable over minor matters, prone to sudden anger or melancholy. Memory falters, and judgment weakens. Decisions about estate management, military planning, or even marriages are clouded. You may not realize it at the time, but the vessels meant to celebrate wealth and refinement are undermining the very authority and efficiency of the households that display them. Reproductive health is particularly affected. Women struggle with miscarriages, and children are often born weak or fail to survive infancy. Fertility declines silently over decades, subtly reducing family lines and inheritance continuity. Chroniclers sometimes record these patterns, describing families as ailing or unlucky, attributing misfortune to divine judgment or the imbalance of humors. Few, if any, suspect that their daily habits, drinking wine from polished lead cups, are the root cause. Even the preparation of food contributes to exposure. wine boiled in lead-lined vessels, syrups sweetened with lead compounds, and certain medicinal concoctions all add to the cumulative intake. Guests at feasts unknowingly consume harmful substances alongside the hosts. You might notice that visitors leave dinners with headaches or digestive discomfort, though they might dismiss it as a passing inconvenience. The practice is pervasive and socially reinforced. To refuse a drink or cup is to insult your host. Thus, the social ritual itself perpetuates the hazard. The impact extends beyond physical health. Neurological decline affects personality and behavior. Leaders become more irritable or indecisive. Diplomacy is compromised by poor judgment. Mismanagement of estates may occur without obvious explanation. These subtle shifts in cognition and temperament have cascading consequences, influencing alliances, inheritance, and even military decisions. A ruler weakened by lead may fail to respond effectively to threats, leaving lands vulnerable to both political and environmental challenges. Interestingly, the perception of poisoning is often present but misdirected. Rival nobles are sometimes accused of deliberate poisoning whenever sudden illness strikes, because the concept of invisible chronic toxins is not recognized. Poisoning is a familiar trope in literature, rumor, and rumor-based justice. In reality, the slow ingestion of lead creates patterns that mimic deliberate acts, seemingly targeted effects on cognition, fertility, and physical health, yet they are accidental and systemic. Despite these dangers, lead remains desirable. Its weight and malleability make it ideal for ornate cups, tankards, and plates. It signals wealth, sophistication, and taste. Households are unlikely to abandon it without clear evidence of harm, evidence that is impossible to gather with contemporary knowledge. Social pressures reinforce the use of lead. To drink from inferior vessels is to appear poor or uncultured, and to question the practice risks ostracism or ridicule. Over decades, some families may notice patterns of decline and seek alternatives, moving to wooden, ceramic, or pewter vessels. Yet adoption is uneven. Some households continue to suffer the insidious effects for generations. The accumulation of lead in the body stored in bones and tissues means that even if cups are replaced, long-term damage persists. Symptoms may continue long after exposure ends, leaving lingering effects on fertility, neurological function, and overall health. The interplay between wealth, culture, and unseen hazards illustrates a broader truth about medieval life. Status symbols are not neutral. They carry material consequences. Practices developed for taste, prestige, or convenience can interact with the natural world in ways that threaten life itself. Lead cups, silent and attractive, are a vivid example of how human innovation and cultural preference can inadvertently produce vulnerability. And as you imagine sitting at a banquet in this medieval hall, lifting a polished lead cup to your lips alongside nobles who share your same oblivious fate, a quiet, unsettling question emerges. How many of the risks that shape societies, weaken leaders, or redirect history are hidden not in wars, famines, or plagues, but in the everyday comforts that people trust the most? By the late 15th century, the consequences of lead exposure in noble households have become both widespread and insidious. Entire family lines may show patterns of infertility or high infant mortality. Lords, once vigorous and decisive, now display signs of neurological decline, tremors, memory lapses, and irritability. Advisors notice that decisions are made with inconsistency or poor judgment, yet they rarely link it to the very vessels used for daily drinking. Instead, blame is placed on fate, divine punishment, or rival intrigue. Chroniclers record unusual weaknesses in rulers, attributing their failures to divine displeasure rather than the accumulation of lead. Historians today note that these subtle declines had cascading consequences. Weakened political leadership could alter military campaigns, destabilize territories, and influence alliances. Social and economic decisions, who to favor, which lands to develop, which trade agreements to pursue, may have been quietly shaped by chemical exposure, a hidden hand influencing the course of history. Within households, the daily rituals that were supposed to signal refinement and prestige now act as agents of harm. Feasts continue with wine, mead, and syrups, all consumed from lead-lined vessels. Guests, too, absorb small doses over time. Chronic poisoning blurs lines between host and visitor, creating widespread vulnerability across social strata. Yet the practice is self-reinforcing. To reject lead is to reject status, and to continue drinking is to maintain prestige. The cycle perpetuates itself, quietly harming all involved. Some families begin to adopt alternative materials for drinking and food preparation. Wooden, ceramic, and pewter vessels gain favor in regions where awareness of health effects grows, often based on observed patterns of sickness and fertility problems. These changes are slow and uneven. Wealthy households, resistant to abandoning traditional symbols of refinement, continue the practice, leaving populations exposed for decades. The invisible hazard persists, silently shaping lives and decisions. Interestingly, the cultural understanding of risk remains incomplete. Even as some adopt safer materials, the logic is often pragmatic rather than scientific. Cups are replaced to avoid visible spoilage, to improve taste, or to emulate neighbors, not because the chemical danger is fully understood. Lead remains an invisible agent of historical consequence, operating below the threshold of perception while altering lives and the functioning of entire households. The story of lead cups illustrates a broader pattern in medieval society. Human innovation and desire for status can inadvertently create long-term risks. Comfort, beauty, and utility are not neutral. They carry consequences that may not manifest until years or decades later. What seems ordinary, lifting a polished cup to the lips, pouring wine for a guest, is a choice with profound and lasting implications. As you imagine a medieval banquet now, the flickering candlelight illuminating polished lead, the chatter of nobles around the table, and the delicate clinking of cups, you recognize the silent danger embedded in ritual and refinement. Wealth and culture have collided with chemistry to produce a slow-acting threat, one invisible yet powerful enough to alter family lines, weaken leaders, and reshape society in ways contemporaries could not perceive. And as you reflect on the scene, a lingering, unsettling thought remains. How often does human history pivot on hidden, silent forces, substances, habits, or cultural practices, whose effects are invisible in the moment, yet echo through generations, shaping lives, power, and the course of entire societies without anyone fully realizing it? Imagine standing in a crowded town square in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518. The sun is high, yet the air feels heavy with heat and dust. Merchants shout to be heard over the clamor. Children chase each other past carts laden with vegetables, and the scent of bread baking in nearby ovens drifts faintly over the square. Amidst this ordinary medieval bustle, a single woman steps forward, her movements awkward at first, then more insistent. She begins to dance. Slowly, then with growing urgency, her feet pound the cobblestones, her arms flail. She does not stop. At first, passers-by watch with curiosity, perhaps amusement. Then she is joined by another, then another, and soon dozens of people fill the square, all dancing with no apparent reason, no music guiding them. Their bodies twist and turn in a strange, almost frenzied rhythm. They are not performing, they are moving compulsively, uncontrollably. The phenomenon spreads like wildfire. Within days the town is gripped by what chroniclers call the dancing plague or the dance mania. The origins of the event are murky. Some contemporaries attribute it to divine punishment, a wrathful god targeting the sinful. Others blame hot blood, an imbalance of humors, or even spells. Physicians and clerics offer conflicting explanations. Town authorities, desperate to control the situation, attempt practical solutions. Musicians are hired to play for the dancers in the hope of channeling the mania, or open-air processions are organized to let participants tire themselves out. These measures, surprisingly, often intensify the phenomenon rather than alleviate it. You might notice the physical toll almost immediately. Dancers collapse from exhaustion, some fainting in the streets. Others develop sores, bruises, and blisters from continuous motion. Malnutrition and dehydration set in. Records suggest that in some cases, individuals danced for days without rest, moving through sun, heat, and rain. The town watches helplessly as life becomes intertwined with compulsion, endurance, and inexplicable contagion. The psychological dimension is fascinating yet disturbing. Participants report a compulsion they cannot resist, a force driving their bodies even when the mind protests. Onlookers feel anxiety and fear as they witness neighbors, friends, and family caught in relentless motion. The communal nature of the phenomenon amplifies it. One person dancing seems to trigger others, suggesting a blend of social contagion, stress, and possibly environmental triggers. Strasbourg, at this time, is recovering from famine, disease, and poor harvests. The collective stress may have primed the population for such extraordinary displays. Authorities struggle to maintain order. Streets are blocked. Clergy bless the dancers. Doctors prescribe rest, cold baths, and bloodletting. Yet the compulsion defies conventional treatment. In some accounts, dancers are brought to chapels and public squares for days in the hope that the sacred space will provide relief. The interventions often fail. The town is caught in a cycle of fascination and horror, unable to comprehend the mechanics of the affliction or how to halt its spread. The social and economic consequences are immediate. Work in the fields and markets slows. Families struggle to maintain daily routines when members are seized by inexplicable frenzy. Trades and crafts falter. Food scarcity, already an issue in post-famine years, becomes more pressing as labor is diverted into uncontrolled dancing rather than sustenance activities. The town teeters on the edge of practical disorder, even as authorities attempt containment. You would observe that the phenomenon is not uniform. Some individuals dance sporadically, others continuously. Children and adults, men and women, are affected. It appears indiscriminate yet selective, striking some and sparing others. Chroniclers offer tales of miraculous intervention, cures through prayer or miraculous exhaustion, but no consistent solution emerges. This unpredictability adds to the town's anxiety and uncertainty. The dancing plague raises questions about human endurance, stress, and social contagion that are still debated today. Was it purely psychological, an extreme case of mass hysteria triggered by environmental stress and communal trauma? Were there physical causes, such as ergot poisoning from contaminated rye, subtly altering neurological function? The truth remains unresolved, leaving historians and scientists intrigued and puzzled alike. As the dancers pound the cobblestones day after day, you feel a growing unease. This is not an isolated incident. It is a vivid reminder of how fragile human behavior can be under extreme stress. Ordinary towns, accustomed to rhythm and routine, can unravel in the face of unseen pressures, producing events that defy explanation and overwhelm even the most rational authorities. And as you imagine the square filled with relentless movement, sweat, and exhaustion, a question lingers in your mind. How often does the pressure of daily survival push communities into extremes, so incomprehensible that they appear almost supernatural? And what does this reveal about the thin line between normalcy and compulsion in human life? As the days pass, the scale of the dancing plague in Strasbourg intensifies. You would notice streets filled with throngs of people moving almost hypnotically, their limbs jerking and twisting in patterns that no one consciously choreographs. Those initially able to dance for a few hours find themselves compelled to continue for days. Exhaustion begins to show. Blisters form on feet and hands, muscles cramp, and some collapse mid-motion only to rise again under the invisible force driving them. The town's authorities grow desperate. City councils try containment strategies. Dancers are moved to open fields to prevent injury in crowded streets, or accompanied by clergy for blessings meant to release the compulsion. Musicians are hired to play continually, hoping rhythm will regulate the dancing. Yet these measures inadvertently amplify the phenomenon. Crowds gather to watch or participate, creating a social feedback loop that spreads the compulsion further. The phenomenon is no longer limited to a few individuals. It becomes a near epidemic of movement. Medical understanding at the time offers little solace. Physicians, operating under humoral theory, prescribe bloodletting, herbal remedies, or rest. Clergy interpret it as divine punishment for sins or indulgence in earthly pleasures. Some suggest the dancers are possessed or cursed. These interventions are inconsistent and largely ineffective. Meanwhile, the town suffers practical consequences. Markets falter, farm labor is interrupted, and daily life becomes precarious. Families attempt to care for dancers, bringing food and water, but the effort strains resources and exacerbates the community's stress. You might notice that not everyone is affected equally. Some remain untouched, either by choice or circumstance, while others are seized repeatedly. Children, adults, men, and women all fall under the compulsion, suggesting that it transcends social class, gender, or occupation. The uneven distribution adds to the town's bewilderment. No clear pattern emerges, making prediction or prevention nearly impossible. Psychological factors play a crucial role. Strasbourg, like much of Europe at this time, had endured famine, disease, and harsh winters. The population is already physically weakened and mentally strained. Stress, anxiety, and grief can manifest in physical ways. The mass dancing can be understood as a form of social contagion, a collective response to extreme tension, amplified by cultural and environmental pressures. It is both symptom and amplifier, a feedback loop that grows more intense the more the town focuses on it. Casual observation belies the human cost. Some dancers die from exhaustion, dehydration, or stroke. Others suffer permanent injury. Yet the spectacle continues. partly because communal attention reinforces participation. Bystanders, whether fearful, curious, or sympathetic, participate indirectly by validating the behavior. The phenomenon becomes self-perpetuating, a tragedy fueled as much by social dynamics as by individual compulsion. Economically, the town suffers cascading effects. Fields go untended, workshops close, and trade slows as labor is diverted into involuntary performance. Food becomes scarcer, and prices fluctuate. Social networks are strained as families attempt to care for dancers while maintaining survival elsewhere. The entire community is caught in the tension between spectacle, compulsion, and necessity. The dancing plague illustrates the fragility of human systems under stress. The boundaries between ordinary behavior and compulsive action blur when populations are pushed to extremes. What begins as a single individual's uncontrolled movement spreads into a communal event, challenging authority, medical understanding, and social cohesion. Strasbourg's experience becomes a case study in how human behavior can cascade unpredictably under pressure. As you watch the streets, filled with relentless motion, the town caught between fear and fascination, one question lingers: how much of human behavior, individually and collectively, is shaped by invisible pressures, stress, environment, social dynamics, and what are the thresholds where ordinary life transforms into something extraordinary, even dangerous? By the third or fourth week of the dancing plague, Strasbourg is transformed. Streets, squares, and open fields are dominated by people moving involuntarily, their feet pounding relentlessly against stone and soil. Exhaustion becomes a common sight. Bodies stumble, collapse, and rise again, driven by a compulsion that seems both psychological and social. The plague has moved beyond a curious spectacle to a crisis that challenges the very functioning of the town. You notice the physical toll most acutely. Blisters, sores, and muscle injuries proliferate. Some dancers collapse permanently, while others develop chronic conditions from repeated stress and overexertion. Dehydration and malnutrition affect those who cannot stop long enough to eat or drink adequately. The town watches helplessly as ordinary people become caught in extraordinary suffering. Despite attempts to aid them, food, water, and prayers, the compulsion overrides self-preservation. Authorities, at their wits' end, escalate interventions. Musicians play continuously in the hope of controlling the rhythm. Clergy organize processions and blessings, praying for divine intervention. Public officials attempt to move dancers to open spaces, believing confinement worsens the condition. Yet, each measure produces mixed results. Some dancers are temporarily diverted, only to return to their compulsive movement, while others are drawn in by the growing spectacle. The social contagion intensifies, making containment nearly impossible. Economically, the town suffers profoundly. Labor shortages affect farming, trade, and craft production. Markets slow or close, as both workers and customers are swept into the compulsion or distracted by fear. Families struggle to maintain food supplies and care for vulnerable members. Resources are stretched, and even small logistical failures carry amplified consequences. The community experiences strain in ways that ripple far beyond the immediate symptoms of the plague. Psychologically, the dancing plague exerts an almost hypnotic effect. Onlookers report anxiety, tension, and a sense of helplessness. Observing a neighbor or friend dance uncontrollably evokes both empathy and fear. The human mind, already conditioned by communal stress and hardship, seems predisposed to follow the example of the dancers. Mass hysteria, reinforced by environmental and social pressures, becomes a tangible force that shapes behavior as profoundly as physical illness. Interestingly, the phenomenon eventually declines, though not through any single intervention. Some dancers collapse from sheer exhaustion, others simply cease moving after days of relentless compulsion. The town, fatigued by weeks of social and physical stress, returns gradually to routine. Life resumes, though the memory of the event lingers. Chroniclers record names, numbers, and the extraordinary persistence of the phenomenon. The psychological, social, and physical impacts remain, shaping perceptions of disease, behavior, and communal response for years to come. The dancing plague serves as a vivid lesson in human vulnerability. Extraordinary events do not always require supernatural causes. Social stress, environmental pressures, and psychological contagion can combine to produce outcomes that seem inexplicable. A single individual's compulsion, left unchecked and magnified by social dynamics, can overwhelm an entire town. Ordinary structures, markets, social hierarchies, religious practices, prove fragile in the face of collective behavioral phenomena. As you picture the exhausted dancers finally coming to rest, the square slowly emptying, and the town returning to routine, one thought remains: human societies can unravel not only through disease, famine, or war, but also through the invisible pressures of stress, contagion, and compulsion. The line between ordinary life and extraordinary crisis is thin, and when it is crossed, even the most mundane settings, town squares, fields, and homes, can become arenas of bewildering human endurance and suffering. Picture a quiet village in medieval France. Early morning mist curling over thatched roofs, smoke rising from chimneys as villagers prepare for the day. Children chase chickens, women draw water from the well, and men head to the fields with plows or axes. Life is predictable, governed by the slow rhythm of work, seasons, and local custom. Yet beneath this ordinary calm lies a hidden force shaping survival: salt, not just as a seasoning, but as a commodity so vital that its control determines life or death. Salt is essential. It preserves food, allows meat and fish to last through winter, and ensures livestock can survive periods of scarcity. Without it, preservation is impossible. Diets become monotonous, and malnutrition follows quickly. In the Middle Ages, it is not merely a kitchen ingredient, it is an economic cornerstone. Wealthy merchants, lords, and monarchs recognize this power, taxing it heavily. Governments see salt as a reliable source of revenue, creating what is known in France as the gabelle, a state monopoly on salt. For villagers, the gabelle is a silent, constant threat. They must purchase salt at prices often far above the local value, sometimes paying several days' wages for a small amount. Those unable to afford it face practical consequences. Meat and fish spoil quickly, cheese sours, and vegetables cannot be preserved. Storage becomes impossible, and families must consume fresh food immediately, which is not always available. Without salt, hunger grows even in times of modest abundance. You might observe that compliance with the tax is not optional. Authorities patrol roads, inspect carts, and impose severe penalties for smuggling or non-payment. Punishments are harsh: fines, imprisonment, or public shaming. Villagers, whose livelihoods already teeter on the edge of subsistence, are forced to make impossible choices. Do they spend precious wages on salt, or on other necessities? Do they risk smuggling to feed their families, knowing the consequences if caught? Survival is a careful calculation, a daily negotiation with both the economy and authority. Salt also creates stark social divisions. Wealthy landowners and merchants have easy access, while peasants struggle. A noble household can preserve meat for months, trade salted fish for profit, and command laborers who cannot afford the same luxury. Inequality becomes baked into daily life, not just through land ownership, but through access to the very substance that sustains life. Ordinary people live constantly aware of scarcity, while wealth and privilege shield others from its effects. The human cost is profound. Children and the elderly suffer first from dietary deficiencies. Starvation can follow in the wake of failed preservation, particularly during harsh winters or crop shortages. Families ration every pinch of salt, often prioritizing preservation of food for essential workers in the household, while weaker members, children or the infirm, receive less. Hunger becomes a quiet, persistent companion. You would also notice creative but desperate adaptations. Villagers sometimes substitute salt with herbs, ash, or brine from other sources, trying to stretch small supplies. Communities might trade labor for salt, or share it collectively, though these practices are informal and precarious. Smuggling, dangerous and illegal, becomes a necessary gamble for survival. Markets, often under surveillance, see clandestine exchanges of salt and salted goods. Risk and reward are calculated daily, and failure can be fatal. Yet, even amidst hardship, the social rituals surrounding salt persist. It is offered as part of hospitality, included in tithes and offerings, and used in religious ceremonies. The substance that is scarce and essential also embodies community and culture. Villagers live with both reverence and fear of it. It sustains life, yet it can be withheld by distant authority. As you imagine this village, small and unremarkable on a map, yet struggling under the invisible weight of the salt tax, a pressing question arises: how many ordinary lives, across centuries, have been quietly shaped, or even destroyed, by the control of a single, seemingly mundane resource? And what does this reveal about the power of invisible systems over daily survival? As the salt tax, the gabelle, tightens its grip, daily life in the village grows increasingly precarious. You notice that households, once self-sufficient, now carefully calculate every pinch of salt. Meat must be consumed or preserved with extreme frugality. Fish caught from nearby rivers is eaten immediately, if it cannot be salted, reducing protein intake and increasing vulnerability to seasonal hunger. Even dairy products, cheese and butter, cannot be stored long-term, forcing families to consume quickly and leaving little for trade or barter. The economic consequences ripple outward. Small-scale farmers, forced to pay taxes on a commodity essential for survival, are left with little to reinvest in seed, tools, or livestock. Laborers already at subsistence level find themselves caught between paying the salt tax and purchasing other necessities. Some families resort to selling personal belongings or mortgaging future crops just to meet obligations. The gabelle transforms ordinary survival into a daily exercise in risk management. Desperation drives innovation, and sometimes crime. Smuggling salt from neighboring regions becomes a calculated gamble. You can picture villagers transporting small amounts hidden under carts or in bundles of straw. If caught, they face fines, imprisonment, or corporal punishment. Yet the need is urgent, compelling people to risk authority in order to preserve their families' lives. Villagers may also form informal networks, pooling salt or trading labor for access, creating a fragile social safety net that operates outside official oversight. Health suffers quietly but consistently. Without adequate preservation, families consume food at the mercy of seasons, relying on fresh crops or fish, which may not be reliable year-round. Malnutrition becomes commonplace, particularly among children, the elderly, and the infirm. Weakness, susceptibility to disease, and stunted growth are often invisible until crises strike, exacerbating the vulnerability of the poorest households. Starvation, though sometimes episodic, leaves lingering effects on productivity and resilience. You would also notice social tensions rising. Wealthy landowners and merchants, fully compliant with the gabelle or able to circumvent it with bribes or influence, appear immune to scarcity. Their households are well stocked, their servants fed, and their surplus goods available for trade. The contrast between privilege and deprivation breeds resentment, suspicion, and occasionally overt conflict. Families who cannot access enough salt may envy or challenge those who can, creating social strain within and between villages. Authorities attempt to enforce compliance with increasing severity. Salt inspectors patrol roads, examine carts, and interrogate travelers. Punishments for smuggling or non-payment escalate. Public shaming, corporal punishment, and imprisonment are common deterrents. Yet enforcement is imperfect, and the very scarcity that motivates smuggling also increases risk-taking. Villagers must balance fear of punishment with the immediate threat of hunger, a daily negotiation between authority and survival. Culturally, salt retains symbolic importance despite its scarcity. It is still used in religious rites, wedding ceremonies, and hospitality, highlighting the tension between reverence and necessity. Communities navigate this delicate balance, ensuring that small rituals persist even as practical consumption remains under strict limitation. Salt embodies both sustenance and social cohesion, creating a paradox where the commodity simultaneously nourishes and oppresses. By the late stages of a particularly harsh tax period, families are forced to make excruciating choices. Children may go without, elders may sacrifice portions of their meager rations, and livestock may be culled prematurely because there is insufficient salt to preserve meat. Entire households teeter on the edge of survival. The once routine act of purchasing and using salt has become an existential concern, a daily reminder of the imbalance between wealth, authority, and human need. And as you imagine the village, a small community contending with invisible forces that control life and death, a larger question emerges: how often have societies allowed a single regulated resource to determine the fate of entire populations? And what does this reveal about the fragile balance between human governance and the necessities of survival? By the final years of strict gabelle enforcement, the consequences of the salt tax are painfully visible in the village. Families who once thrived now struggle to maintain basic sustenance. Children are smaller and weaker than their parents were at the same age. Illness is more common, often exacerbated by malnutrition. Livestock is reduced. Fields lie fallow for lack of resources to preserve harvests, and the community exists in a constant state of precarious survival. Economic disparities are sharply highlighted. Wealthy landowners and merchants continue to benefit from access to salt, able to preserve meat, cheese, and fish for trade or storage. They manipulate supply chains, stockpiling where possible and avoiding shortages, while the peasantry faces real hunger. Inequality becomes not just a social grievance but a matter of life and death. The salt tax transforms ordinary survival into a system that disproportionately favors privilege. Desperation drives both ingenuity and rebellion. Villagers attempt increasingly daring smuggling operations, moving salt across regions, hiding it in carts, or forming covert networks to share access. Some communities petition local lords for relief, offering labor or other goods in exchange for reduced taxes. Occasional uprisings occur when enforcement becomes unbearable, illustrating the deep resentment and unrest simmering beneath the surface of daily life. Yet authorities respond harshly, punishing offenders publicly, further cementing fear and obedience. The human cost is compounded by physical and social vulnerability. Hunger and malnutrition weaken immune systems, making disease outbreaks more deadly. Family units are strained as parents make impossible choices, often prioritizing laborers or older children over the youngest. Social cohesion is tested as neighbors must choose between helping each other or preserving scarce resources for their own households. The salt tax infiltrates every aspect of life, shaping behavior, morality, and survival strategy. Yet, despite suffering, resilience emerges. Villagers develop informal networks of support, sharing what little they have and passing knowledge about salt conservation and smuggling techniques to the next generation. Communal ingenuity demonstrates the ability to adapt under pressure, even when governed by an oppressive economic system. Knowledge of preservation, trade, and negotiation becomes as vital as farming skills or craftsmanship. The broader impact of the salt tax extends far beyond the village. Regions with harsher taxation see population stagnation or decline, social unrest, and economic disruption. Chroniclers note famines exacerbated, not solely by weather or war but by the structural limitations imposed by the state-controlled commodity. Life and death, productivity and poverty, are dictated by access to a single essential resource, revealing the far-reaching consequences of seemingly mundane policies. Standing in the village now, observing the exhausted but determined families, one realizes that survival is not just a matter of skill or will but of navigating the invisible forces that govern resources. Salt, a simple mineral, has dictated life and shaped society in ways that echo through generations. Authority, economy, and daily sustenance intersect, creating a precarious balance that can tip with small disruptions. And as you reflect on the centuries that followed, a thought lingers: how many other policies, economic systems, or monopolies have silently dictated the well-being of entire communities, and how often do ordinary people bear the weight of decisions made far beyond their control? Picture a rural landscape in 14th century England, rolling hills dotted with thatched cottages and grazing livestock. The air carries the scent of damp earth, fresh hay, and the occasional smoke from a hearth. Villagers move about in quiet routine, tending fields, repairing fences, or guiding oxen to plough. Life seems stable, governed by the steady rhythm of seasons and labor. Yet beneath this ordinary pastoral scene, a quiet threat emerges, one born of abundance rather than scarcity. Sheep. Sheep are prized across medieval England. Wool is the lifeblood of commerce. It fuels local economies, trades in distant markets, and underpins the wealth of lords and monarchs alike. A single well-managed flock can bring substantial income, while surplus animals can be sold or traded. The textile industry, both domestic and international, depends heavily on these humble creatures. For a lord, more sheep promise greater wealth and prestige. But with abundance comes unforeseen risk. Overgrazing becomes a problem when land is converted to accommodate increasingly large flocks. Fields once used for crops are turned into pastures. Fertile soil is stripped of vegetation, leaving exposed ground vulnerable to erosion. Villagers notice that certain areas, once rich with produce, now yield less grain and vegetables. Food security begins to decline quietly, as the land's carrying capacity is stretched beyond its natural limit. Sheep bring another, less visible danger: disease. Livestock is prone to plagues that can spread quickly through dense flocks. Outbreaks of foot and mouth disease, rinderpest, or other infections can decimate herds within weeks. The consequences for humans are not direct in terms of infection, but economic and nutritional. Loss of livestock means loss of wool, meat, and trade goods, destabilizing both household and local economies. Villagers reliant on sheep for supplementary food or barter are immediately impacted. You notice social tension growing as well. Lords and wealthy farmers prioritize sheep for wealth generation, often at the expense of communal arable land. Peasants, who must rely on small plots for subsistence crops, find their access to fertile soil diminished. Disputes over land allocation, grazing rights, and the timing of harvests increase. The apparent prosperity brought by sheep masks and underlying fragility, the very source of wealth, threatens survival when it overshadows essential food production. Environmental degradation becomes increasingly visible. Hillsides are stripped of vegetation, compaction of soil reduces its fertility, and erosion accelerates. Streams may become polluted with runoff from overgrazed lands. Local ecosystems shift, with wild flora and fauna displaced by pastures dominated by sheep. Villagers observe changes in bird populations, the disappearance of certain herbs, and fluctuations in water quality. The landscape itself begins to reflect the consequences of unchecked livestock expansion. Despite these pressures, sheep remain indispensable. Lords demand more wool, merchants clamor for textiles, and the economy incentivizes expansion of flocks. Peasants and shepherds comply, sometimes reluctantly, caught between necessity and the risk to land and food supply. The very creatures that promise wealth simultaneously threaten the subsistence of those who live closest to them. By the end of this initial phase, you sense a tension that underpins every aspect of life in these rural communities. Sheep symbolize prosperity, status, and commerce, yet they silently undermine agriculture, nutrition, and social stability. Their presence shapes daily routines, economic decisions, and even social hierarchies. Villagers navigate a delicate balance, understanding that survival depends not only on tending animals, but also on protecting the land and food sources that sustain life. And as you look across the rolling hills, dotted with flocks grazing under the watchful eyes of shepherds, a troubling question emerges: how can a society reconcile wealth generated by abundance with the invisible costs to survival? And what happens when the very symbols of prosperity threaten to destabilize the communities that depend on them? As decades pass, the tension between wealth and subsistence grows more acute. Villagers notice subtle but persistent changes in the landscape. Hillsides once fertile and diverse are now dominated by short, overgrazed grass. Soil compaction prevents water absorption, leading to seasonal flooding in lower fields. Streams run murky with sediment, and patches of land that once yielded vegetables or grains now barely produce a harvest sufficient for family needs. Sheep, once seen as benign or beneficial, have become a force that reshapes the environment and daily life. The consequences for human health are tangible. With less arable land, crop yields decline, and food security weakens. Families rely more heavily on what can be grown on smaller plots or purchased from markets, often at higher costs. Malnutrition becomes more common, especially during winters when stored food is insufficient. Children are smaller and more prone to illness. Adults exhibit signs of fatigue, reflecting the strain of reduced nutrition combined with demanding labor. The prosperity of wool trade comes at a subtle but real cost to the physical well-being of those who produce it. Economic pressures compound the environmental challenges. Lords demand ever larger flocks to meet the demands of domestic and international markets. Shepherds expand grazing areas into marginal lands, often encroaching on community cropland. Disputes erupt over rights to pastures and access to water. Some families are forced to abandon portions of their land or sell off livestock unrelated to wool, sacrificing immediate sustenance for economic compliance. Wealth, in this context, becomes a double-edged sword, profitable in trade, but destabilizing for local survival. Disease continues to plague sheep, and, indirectly, humans. Outbreaks of livestock illness reduce wool supply and meat availability, forcing communities to rely on limited resources for longer periods. The interconnectedness of livestock and human survival becomes painfully clear. A single infection in a flock can cascade through an economy, reducing trade income and food stores simultaneously. Villagers must carefully monitor the health of their animals while balancing their own subsistence needs, a precarious juggling act with high stakes. Social dynamics shift as well. Shepherds and laborers gain increased importance, their knowledge of flocks and land management valued highly, yet they are also under immense pressure. Mistakes in grazing, disease management, or timing of shearing can have catastrophic consequences. At the same time, peasants without flocks may feel marginalized, forced to accept reduced access to land and resources to accommodate the wealth-generating sheep. Communities live in tension between cooperative management and competition for survival. You would notice subtle adaptations emerging. Crop rotation strategies are adjusted to protect soils, and communal grazing rules may be established to prevent overuse. Some families diversify livestock, keeping goats or cattle to supplement food supply and reduce reliance on sheep. Water management techniques improve, with channels dug to prevent erosion and protect remaining croplands. These incremental changes reflect human resilience. Survival requires constant observation, adaptation, and negotiation with both animals and environment. Yet for all these adjustments, the fundamental dilemma remains. Sheep are economically indispensable, yet environmentally disruptive. Wool trade generates wealth for lords and merchants, but undermines the very foundation of village subsistence. Villagers are trapped in a system where profit and survival are in constant tension, and every decision carries long-term consequences for both human and ecological stability. By the end of this period, you realize that the presence of sheep is no longer a simple agricultural matter. It has become a force shaping society, health, economy, and land management. The animals that symbolize prosperity also enforce limitations on daily life, forcing villagers to negotiate a delicate balance between wealth and survival. The consequences are neither immediate nor dramatic, but persist quietly, subtly reshaping generations. And as you watch flocks grazing in carefully managed pastures, a question lingers: how often has human prosperity, built on the exploitation of natural resources, quietly imposed costs that ripple through communities, shaping health, society, and the environment in ways that only later generations can fully comprehend?